I'm George, a Senior Investment Analyst at Quantum Advisory, and whilst this video is not meant to be advice, I'll be talking about curve risk within the context of liability matching strategies. Many defined benefit pension schemes develop liability matching strategies to hedge their interest rate exposure of their liabilities with a focus on the percentage of liabilities or assets they have hedged. This comes with the knowledge that if interest rates fall, the value of the scheme's liabilities would rise. Schemes therefore want to protect themselves from the negative impact this can have on their surplus or funding levels. However, when hedging interest rate exposure, there are other risks that should also be considered. One of these is curve risk. Curve risk is the risk of a negative impact on a portfolio or scheme as a result of changes in the shape of the yield curve. We have seen the shape of the yield curve change quite significantly over the past few years as a result of changes in economic conditions or market expectations. One significant example of this happened during the gilts crisis under the Liz Truss government. During this period, we saw short-term gilt yields fall as economic conditions worsened and the market was pricing in interest rate cuts. At this time, Liz Truss also announced an excessive tax reduction plan, which caused long-term gilt yields to rise. This was because the market began to question the credibility of the government under Liz Truss and the effects of her proposed policies on long-term inflation. So, we saw the shape of the yield curve change or twist as shorter-term interest rates fell and longer-term interest rates rose. Although this is a significant short-term example, in general, the yield curve continually changes as the economy goes through different stages of the market cycle. This can have a negative impact on pension schemes if there is a mismatch between the interest rate exposure of the liability matching assets and the liabilities across different points along the yield curve. This can be a significant risk for pension schemes, particularly those that are targeting higher hedging levels relative to the size of their liabilities. And in general, we've seen hedging levels increase following the rise in gilt yields, and therefore I think it's important that trustees consider curve risk when designing a liability matching strategy. One example of curve risk is where pension schemes hold longer dated bonds in their liability matching portfolio relative to their liabilities in order to increase hedge ratios. The reason trustees may look to do this is because longer dated bonds are more sensitive to changes in interest rates than shorter dated bonds, and this is because they have higher durations, and so by using longer dated bonds, a scheme can reduce the initial level of capital required to produce the same absolute interest rate exposure. However, this can have an impact on the funding level if the shape of the yield curve changes. In contrast, if the shape of the yield curve is constant, this wouldn't have an effect. In this example, the liability matching assets are more exposed to longer dated gilt yields and less exposed to shorter dated gilt yields relative to the liabilities. So, remembering that as interest rates decrease, prices increase, this can have a negative impact on a scheme's funding level or surplus in one of two ways. Firstly, when short-term interest rates fall by more than long-term interest rates. This is because the value of the liabilities will rise by more than the assets. The liabilities are more exposed to shorter dated gilt yields than the assets. Alternatively, if long-term interest rates rise by more than short-term interest rates, the value of the assets will fall by more than the liabilities. This is just one example of how curve risk can affect pension scheme portfolios, and it's definitely something for trustees to be aware of. There are a number of ways to mitigate curve risk, however. The first one is to match the yield curve exposure of the liabilities at different maturities when implementing the liability matching assets. Trustees can also go a step further by matching the estimated cash flows of the liabilities. By doing this, the scheme's interest rate exposure is more accurately matched across the yield curve, which can immunise the surplus or funding level from curve risk. Additionally, trustees can also implement hedge ratio monitoring to assess the scheme's hedge ratio at different points in time. This can be done to ensure it matches their target or expectations. Finally, it is important to rebalance the liability matching portfolio at regular intervals to ensure it's still providing an accurate hedge. So, if you have any questions about liability matching or how to manage curve risk, then please get in touch with us and we'd be more than happy to help.